Okay, and I will kick it off. So just a quick little background on the Integrity Institute. It is a part professional community, part think tank. And on the professional community side, we are made up of what we call integrity professionals. These are tech workers who have worked on social internet companies on integrity or trust and safety teams. So we are the people who have, fought misinformation, hate speech, self-injury content, all that kind of stuff from the inside of the companies. What we do at the Integrity Institute is we build and empower the community of integrity professionals. We advise online platforms, policymakers, and academics on how to put integrity at the heart of all of their activities. And we educate the public about what an integrity-first future could look like for the social internet. We're now at over 400 members with experience across 50 different platforms. So, we actually are coming from a place of sort of, deep insider expertise and knowledge. So the presentation that we're going to give you today combines ideas from our previous briefings that were election integrity best practices. And so part one, the first briefing that we did there was about how to responsibly support elections online. And it was kind of just like giving an overview of what does it look like for a platform to responsibly support an election. And then part two was about defining and achieving success. And it went into more in depth about how platforms should be setting goals and measuring success and measuring the readiness, as well as a collection of different product design interventions and considerations, how to work with external partners, and then a lot of critical topics. Those briefings were actually targeted towards the company themselves, right? So the intended audience for those briefings was kind of the smaller or maybe mid-sized companies that didn't have a deep experience working on election integrity and could use, guidance and advice from people who had done it for, 10 years at some of the larger companies. We have reworked those briefings to be more relevant to a civil society type audience, right? And so, you are now the intended audience of the briefing that sort of combines the ideas from those other two. And so our goal from this presentation is to sort of help establish what you could expect from platforms around elections. What are the important things for platforms to be doing publicly, doing in the public and with transparency, and our general recommendations on how to interact with the platforms. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the current environment in 2024, and it's really interesting for a lot of different reasons. First up, we're now in our second year, basically, of the tech layoff, the industry downturn. We've seen layoffs at all the major companies. We've seen layoffs at the smaller companies. This has impacted policy team, user researchers, partnership managers. These are a lot of the teams that, are responsible for interfacing with civil society. And at some companies, this has been extremely severe. So at like Twitter/X, for example, right, like the cut in trust and safety teams and partnership teams has been pretty dramatic. There's also more diversity in platforms. TikTok is much bigger than it was in the last cycle, whether that was 2020 or earlier. There's a lot of mid-sized platforms that have come on, so like Discord and Twitch, which are now playing a bigger role. And they just don't quite have that same experience and that same level of resources that the Meta and the Googles have. There's also, platforms that don't necessarily care as much about integrity, right? So Telegram is now a major platform in many countries around the world and doesn't particularly care about integrity, doesn't particularly prioritize trust and safety. We also see that platforms are actually trying to move away from politics and move away from civic discussions. So TikTok has banned political ads, which isn't that out of the norm, like other platforms have banned that, but they've also prohibited politicians from fundraising on the platform. Meta is broadly trying to move away from the civic space and the news space, both in Facebook, Threads, and Instagram. And then in the US, at least, we have seen the government agencies actually pull back from partnering with the platforms. So sort of like how platforms are thinking about politics is definitely changing. And then, of course, there's the AI factor, right? So it's like Gen AI is now currently being used in elections for, some more benign purposes, but also some less benign purposes. Lots of platforms have introduced policies and they're ramping up on that. And there's plenty of signs of, AI chatbots can pose a risk, right? By like not giving accurate information about voting. And it's a big year for elections. So it kind of depends exactly on how you count, but it's 65 or maybe over 80 elections in 54 different countries. And all of this is to say that like it's not like the platforms are not doing anything, right? Platforms are certainly saying less about their election efforts, but they are doing a lot of the things that they have done before. But less resources means that they might be overstretched, right? And so, we've seen cuts in the partnerships teams, which means that, the people that are left on the partnerships teams are going to have to be supporting more organizations on the outside, right? So they're going to be a little bit stretched. And less transparency, right? Just makes it a little bit more difficult to hold them accountable. We've also seen a turn towards compliance, right? And in some ways, this is actually really good, right? I mean, like the DSA has put out the election integrity guidance, which is a really great standard and benchmark to sort of point to and say, hey, platforms, you need to be doing this. But it could also pivot away from, we could be entering an era when platforms are less proactive about coming up with different ways to more responsibly design their platforms and are just relying upon government advice so that they comply with. Some things that we've seen the platforms say that they are doing, focusing on AI, election centers is a very common practice, surfacing authoritative information about voting, combating foreign influence operations, of course, partnering with fact checkers and doing fact checking, and investing in media literacy. Some of the key takeaways, right, that we think come from this deck is that the environment in 2024 is just, different than it was a few years ago, right? There's a lot of elections, platforms have less capacity, but there's also becoming more government scrutiny, which is probably a good thing. And there's some, guardrails against the platforms divesting too much on election integrity. There's a lot that we very validly need to be asking from platforms, right? Like we need platforms to take elections seriously and proper resource them. We need platforms to clearly communicate their goals and their efforts around elections. We need platforms to engage productively and beneficially with civil society. We need platforms to prepare for and study the risks that their platforms can create, especially in a transparent fashion. But also platforms have varying level of resources to tackle this, right? Like there's a lot of small platforms out there that just aren't going to have the same level of resources to be comprehensive on all these different fronts as the larger platforms like Meta and Google. And there's also some best practices that we should expect from platforms, but also that we can advise to civil stakeholders and how to engage with platforms, right? So, we would like to see platforms designed responsibly and properly ready and prepared for critical events. And we do think that there's things that external stakeholders can do to both support and pressure and influence the platforms to enact real change. And on that note, I will hand it over to Glenn to start talking about how platforms can be approaching elections.
Appreciate you sticking with me, and Jeff and I. So I'm actually going to be talking about two pieces of this before I hand back over to Jeff. I'm going to talk, sort of give you, and both Jeff and I have been inside platforms working on these things, but I'm going to give you a little bit of that inside out perspective of sort of how platforms look at this and how we hope they look at this. And then also some of what I think we can legitimately ask of platforms and should be asking and demanding of platforms as they're figuring out how they're going to work through elections. And then I will hand back to Jeff just to give you a little preview to really talk about sort of risk analysis and then specifically ways to try and be strong partners and to challenge platforms to do their best work. So that's sort of what remains ahead. And with that, I think the interesting thing about this from inside the platforms is I'm going to start at the top of like why platforms even care. And I think platforms care for a couple of core reasons. One is that, fortunately, I think most of the people inside most of these platforms are actually pretty strong believers in democracy. And democracy is actually pretty good for platforms, right? Like platforms are going to be more successful in worlds where, free speech, not necessarily in specifically the American definition, but like where people are free to interact with each other. There's a lot of freedom to exchange ideas and to have commerce and all those sorts of things. And that generally aligns with Western democratic principles. So the companies sort of want to help. But they also are motivated for their internal things. And it's worth noting that we see things happening on platforms where we think, oh my goodness, this is a risk to our democracies and to how successful we're going to be and how fair we're going to be in our elections. But it runs the other direction as well, which is that platforms in elections are subject to regulatory concerns, legal liability, reputational risks. And it's sort of fortunate that creates some alignment. And these risks to the platforms can give us an additional spur to get companies to raise their game and to take some integrity steps they wouldn't otherwise take. But it's also worth noting that at times we won't be fully aligned with people inside the platforms, which I used to be, and the people outside the platforms living in the democracies, which I now am. And so to think about part of the reason I want to share, sort of not only how platforms look at this, but also how we in the Institute are encouraging platforms to look at this, is to sort of give that inside out perspective and help make those connections across some of those differences. I will also note that elections integrity is just one of many integrity things that platforms deal with. It's actually kind of interesting because elections are, in a way, they're events. They are like a crisis that you can see coming, right? In the sense that, things happen on a platform, the platform has to react to a global happening. A pandemic was not, is a big example that wasn't predicted, but we can see the elections coming. So again, while elections really stress out companies, they really stress out our democratic processes as well, and they are the stress tests. They're the foreseeable stress tests that actually give us an opportunity to make a real difference in the election context and frankly also beyond. So when platforms are thinking about this, we always encourage them. And I think at least the larger platforms are beginning to have this discipline of really viewing this as a long-term engagement and a long process. Platforms need to start early so they understand and have time to analyze how will my platform be used in this election for good and for ill? How do I understand how that election works? Who the players in that election are, who the parties who could help me through that are, and where the vulnerabilities in the shape of my platform are that are likely to get exploited. So they have to do that analysis. And then, as Jeff alluded to, all these companies are in different places. I don't mean physically, I mean in terms of their own growth, in terms of their staffing levels. And therefore, they have to actually look at what they're going to be able to achieve and what they need to achieve and make some hard decisions about prioritization and setting of goals. I'll make this sort of a little personal. I joined Meta just as they came to a realization based on looking at the elections that have been happening from 2016, 2017, 2018, that they'd been spending a lot of time trying to encourage democratic participation and really reinforcing positive things around awareness and voting drives and that sort of thing. And they realized they had to actually do a little bit of a pivot because given even their large resource pool, they said we really have to address disinformation, misinformation, online harassment, and a bunch of other things that were deeper threats. And so they had to pick between goals because even at their size, they couldn't do everything. So as they're looking at this list of controls, I won't list of concerns. I'm not going to read out the whole list, but just sort of think about as a platform, you're thinking about how good information flows. You're thinking about how dangerous information flows. You're thinking about how specific features, especially things like advertising, which tends to be highly, more regulated and more visible, and maybe something at which we hold platforms to a higher standard. So you've got these different sort of things that the platform's attention is also drawn across in an election season. So as they're thinking about all of these things, they're also thinking about how their platform shape, right, needs to inform their priorities. And I'll start at the highest level. You can certainly imagine that if if what you're providing is encrypted person-to-person messaging, well, you understand that you've got risks around the circulation of illegal content, and you've got lots of small groups in which information can move. But it's a very, very different environment with a different risk profile than, let's say, your Twitter-esque broad public discussions forums, right? At least in those sorts of forums, if somebody's saying something, there's this opportunity for anybody to wander in and challenge that, for better and for worse. Whereas in a chat situation, nobody's going to see what's happening. Outside organizations don't have a chance to see into those chats. But on the other hand, there's somebody can't drop into your chat quite so easily and start harassing you. So different sorts of risk profiles and different things to be elevated and to consider. And rather than sort of laundry listing this, let me give an example. And this is two platforms that I both worked with fairly closely, Facebook and Instagram. And those are both platforms actually that you would kind of put in the same box if you're drawing the wide thing, right? They're not chat-centric platforms. They're feed-based, post-based platforms where material can be fairly widely distributed. But if you look at the details of how these platforms actually implement, and quite intentionally, my view of Instagram here is several years old, and several things have changed since then because Facebook/Meta seems to believe that they should turn all products into the same product and be everything for everybody. But that's a topic for another day. But suffice to say, when you look at sort of what the core of these products was, Facebook was text and then links, and it was really all about sharing. So it was lots of reshare of one post to a different audience and to additional feeds. There was linking of that thing that might be shared from outside of Facebook in. And so you had this content that Facebook didn't directly see or have authority over because it's external to the platform. And it was getting shared through these viral links. On Instagram, at least in the original product, there were no links. It was only content that you actually produced or at least hosted inside the Instagram app. And you couldn't reshare into feed. I mean, you could always snapshot, always screenshot something and talk about it, but you couldn't just hit a button and reshare it. So you had very different information propagation, even in these two sort of seemingly similar products. And there were other differences that also have implications, but to give a sense. And then lastly, again, as Jeff alluded to, not all these companies have the same level of resource. So the way that process looks and the kind of resources that can be put against it if you're in one of these very large online platforms looks really, really different than if you're at a newer or smaller player. And there's a nice graph here with some blue bars. It seems to suggest that some platforms are bigger than others. Look closely. That is a logarithmic scale. So what this graph is actually telling you is that if you look at a Mastodon and a Blue Sky and you compare them to an Alphabet or a Meta, you're looking at something like 4 orders of magnitude more resources at those big firms than at the little operations. So it really is something where the democracy is the same. The election is the same, but the way the platform can even consider acting in that same situation is very, very different. So with all of that, they're making these tough choices and figuring out how they can support. And I actually want to highlight 2 things this year and in general that are out there that I think are key. I'm calling them conflating risks, right? These are key things that are extra hazardous for programs, for platforms to be negotiating their way through. And the first of them is local support. So obviously, some of the biggest platforms that we know and are familiar with are based in certain countries, a lot of them in the US, some other places. And, they probably have, therefore, a bunch of staff that's deep in the context of the place where the company's based. That's not to say they don't hire internationally, but that's where their core is. And it's often where their user base first grew as well. And then the question is, as they're used in more places, how ready is that platform to take something that it did once and either trust that it works generally or to re-implement it across different geographies and communities? And there's a pair of challenges here, partly straight up language, like can you actually understand the content that is on your platform? Do the people who need to look at it, and do the programs that you're building to make automated decisioning and prioritization of it understand it? And then secondly, do you have enough local context? And this is perennially a challenge. Structurally, it's always going to be a challenge. I'm not giving platforms a pass on this, and we'll come back to this about how I think what we should ask for from platforms around this. But it's always going to be a thing. And you see, even you take a US platform like a Facebook and you look at how they support Spanish-speaking communities in the United States, and they struggle. And you look at how they support let's say the Vietnamese American population, and I live in San Jose, which has the largest community of Vietnamese people living outside of Vietnam. And that group of people not only speaks Vietnamese, which is not well staffed, I think, even inside a large organization, but they also share a certain cultural perspective, right? The people who came to the United States from Vietnam often came towards the end of, the Vietnam War, and they all exited that country because they had ties to the United States. And so there's a cultural shared experience of that sub community within the country, which again there's many of those communities, and staffing and having that depth in all of them is very, very challenging. And certainly in a place like Europe, even more challenging with many more languages, many communities of people living in the same country, and also communities that are spread across multiple countries, but share, some cultural territory. So very challenging. And then the second one I think that we're seeing this year is generative AI. And on the one level, you can say generative AI, it generates a bunch of fake information, and fake information is not new. Politicians have been lying since there's been politicians. And so and people have had imperfect information forever. But I think what's really generative AI is somewhat qualitatively changing is that it's just in everybody's hands. And it's fascinating what that changes, and we're still learning how that changes. But you would expect the disinformation networks to be using this to create more convincing things. But then you see that individual campaigns and partisans who are not even attached to the campaigns are using these same tools. I'll use another American example, which is that as one of the campaigns, the Trump campaign is reaching out to Black American voters in this cycle. There are individual partisans, Trump supporters, who are creating deep faked images of Trump together in imagery with Black Americans, images of things that did not occur, and they're being actually generated by individual people to try and support a message and a cause and to share what they believe would be a great thing. Um, and that's something where you certainly would have expected sort of a groundswell of convincing fakes from lots of people. So that's lots of interesting things about how that's changing the market as well. So that's sort of how platforms look at this, some of the constraints they're facing, some of the dangers that they're facing, and some of the ways that it differs across platforms. So um, the second topic that I wanted to spend a little time on is, given what they're facing, we could give them a pass and say, that sounds tough, fine. I guess we'll deal with it all ourselves. Or we can say, all right, given that we want to be able to partner with them, we want to not get destroyed by things that happen on their platforms, what are the right things to demand of them? And that's sort of the next sections. And a lot of it is going to be clarity, right? I think we do have to accept that platforms can't do all that we would like them to do. Platforms cannot do all that they themselves would like to do. So, as they're making their planning decisions, as they're setting their goals, as they're figuring out what they can and cannot commit to, the first thing we need to ask of them and demand of them and clearly request is that clarity. So, are you taking, specific positions in support of democracy? Are you willing to behave in this election on the basis that this is a legitimate, valuable election? Because another thing that is true, as we all know, is that the quality of the democracy and the democratic norms do vary around the world, and so some elections, frankly, are more legitimate, more fair than others. So, what does a platform want to say about that? What does that mean for their participation in organizational drives? When it comes to harms, what harms has that platform identified as the ways that their platform could really contribute to bad outcomes and to harms that would affect the election process? And of those, then, all right, so you've addressed what you think you want to address. What commitments are you actually willing to make about those areas? So we're here to fight misinformation with you. That's a nice soundbite. What do you actually mean? How will we know what you're doing? And it can be incredibly challenging to measure these things. Taking, again, misinformation as the example, misinformation is going to increase around election contexts. is going to increase across all channels, right? Because there's more motivation to spread it in these times. So as that is going on, what does success look like? Does success look like mean there's no misinformation, nobody lies online and gets away with it? It does not. We all know it does not mean it. And does it mean that you've kept it at a baseline and you've kept it from increasing at all? Probably doesn't even mean that. So how do you judge what targets is the platform willing to commit to, and how are they providing enough transparency for us to actually see that they're doing it? So this is what we should be demanding first. What are you going to do? Show us how you're going to do it and how we'll know you did it. Second thing is, in order to achieve those goals, companies will rely in many parts of this process on policies. And the policies are useful in two ways. One is that's how they can determine what they're willing to sanction on their platform. So like, hey, we're going to say, you cannot tell actual factual lies about news topics or something, right? And that's a policy decision. And or they might say, we want to be free for all, and let people come in and from the outside and have open debate, right? Those are two policy extremes that are not really realistic, but to give an idea. And as they're making these policies, they both should guide how we use the platform, because we should probably try and abide by their policies, but they also tell us a lot about how they're going to be able to enforce and choose to enforce towards their goals. So I will just highlight, without going into a lot of detail, that the policy set from every company, every platform, always involves sort of steady state policies that might have some differences in how they're applied in the election, but are not for the election. For example, most platforms already have policies around harassment and policies around misinformation, but they may need to step them up or whatever, or create some special context for around the election. And then there are policies that are electoral specific, or often that's around like political advertising as an example. And then lastly, and this is one I don't think we ask as often as we could, is what policies might the platform invoke if or as needed to deal with a crisis? So what would a crisis look like, Meta, or other platforms, and what are you going to do? And example would be, for instance, a contested election where the apparently defeated party is not agreeing with that outcome, right? Like, what are you going to do in that situation? So these are kinds of questions we can ask and ask for clarity on. Now, there's a bunch of follow-up questions, which I am not going to read out to y'all because nobody wants me to just sit here and read a slide. But it'll be in the notes, and I'll just, I'll pull out one example, like amplification here. Like, sometimes platforms are trying to demote politics. Other times it might be like, I want to advantage, government communication around this. Okay, so what government, what promotion are you giving? Or you want to demote politics. What does politics mean? And these are the sorts of things where there's a whole bunch of useful follow-up questions that I think it would be wonderful to have a lot of us get in the habit. And I say us because I'm now outside platforms as well. Be asking around that clarity. So clarity on goals, clarity on policies, and then the remainder of the things I think we want to ask is basically for some proof that they're actually going to be ready to achieve the goals, right? You're committing to the goals, you got policies to support that. Are you actually ready to do it? And the natural pair to a policy, what's permitted, what's not permitted, is your operational readiness to enforce that policy, or those sets of policies more accurately. And this is where I think it's very legitimate to ask platforms of all sizes, right? Hey, we know elections are hard. They move fast. You're going to get like lots of blowback on everything you do. You're going to have, instead of like, sort of a paste of issues across all the places that you might be serving, you're going to have a real concentration on it in the place that the election is happening. So during the EU cycle, there's going to be a lot more politics, a lot more misinformation, a lot more of a lot of things in the EU. And you expect it to go down, and then there'll be an Indonesian election, and you're going to have to paste that. So it's going to challenge the operational readiness of platforms. And I don't think platforms in general would deny that. They would agree, yes, this is a challenging sort of situation. And they'll say, and we've hired 300 people. Like, okay, what does that mean? Yes, you need to have enough people. You need to make sure that especially where people are not in their usual roles, or where you're bringing in extra sort of surge resourcing of any type, that they're trained and supported. But equally so, I think we should be asking platforms, are they really ready to work within their own company? This is certainly advice in the Institute that we give companies very strongly is, are you sure that you've got the processes? So if you got 300 people, what the hell are they going to do? Do you have a way to ensure that decisions are going to get made consistently, no matter which of those 300 reviewers that you just hired happens to see a particular piece of content? Do you have a way to ensure that when you've made a decision, and then a government minister calls their friend who's a VP and says, "What the hell did you just do?" That you can get that call routed through a consistent escalation process. And it isn't just a VP going, oh, fix it, fix it, fix it. And instead, it's something that, again, is a process that can be believed in, can function, and can move quickly in a fast-moving situation. And the last thing we encourage companies to do, and I think this is something we can all ask them, is, how ready are you for insert scary situation here? The more they're ready for, the more they've teamed out and looked through and laid track for, the more they're going to be able to handle what comes up during the election season. The other thing, as external parties to platforms, is we should actually ask them specifically how ready they are to work with us. And obviously, elections bring platforms in contact with a lot of groups that they might have less contact with in other forms. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but I think it's very legitimate for us, as we represent some of these external communities, to say, how are you going to work with us? And I'm going to go into just a couple of those communities. One is certainly governments. So some people on the call may be in government. Other people may have an interest in how platforms are going to engage with governments. And so, let's ask, how are you going to support elections commissions and other elections authorities that actually need to get out critical information? How are you going to respond to requests from governments? Official legal requests saying that there's something unacceptable happening on your platform, or maybe the less official requests as well that come from members of governments. What would we expect platforms to do, and what are they willing to say about what they're going to do? And this, again, largely goes back to having clarity. If we've got, as a government, to come in and tell you about a problem, who do we call? How do we do it? And how are we going to learn that? How are you going to confirm that you've heard us and have reacted in the way that you want? Obviously, from the inside out perspective, I'll also say remind people that platforms need to understand how they're going to react to government requests, aka government interventions, government interference. You can use all these different words, right? And certainly some types of government requests would have implications for the freedom and fairness of the election. So this is the kind of thing that is very fair to ask platforms how they're going to engage. Second group that I'll call out is political actors. These are distinct from governments, although there's an overlap, obviously, because some political actors are in government. But, hey, platforms, are you offering support to actors? Are you encouraging them to use your platform for fundraising, for get out the vote, for sharing information? If so, how do you decide who's eligible for any elevated assistance you give? How do you try and make sure that you're doing that in a fair and balanced way? And then the third group I'll call out is civil society as a whole. And there's so many great engagements, there's so many ways that civil society can help. And Jeff's going to talk some more about this, so I'm not going to go in detail, but obviously platforms can benefit from the information and the local context and the issue-specific context that certain organizations will really be focused on. Sometimes they want to partner for things like fact checking or other types of reporting of serious problems, and even just partnering to elevate pro-social information, content, goals. It's all fantastic. Across all of those, though, as we are in civil society, we should be asking platforms not just hey, can I do this thing, but we should be reminding them about what a successful engagement can look like. Can we please be building relationships ahead of the moment where you suddenly need something from us, or we suddenly need something from you? How do we get across some of the cultural differences between the for-profit companies and civil society organizations, and even be able to talk in the same terminology to effectively figure out what we mean? And then, how can we make sure that those engagements benefit both parties and are reasonably streamlined? So that's sort of around engagement. And then last and certainly not least, so they talked about goals. They've given us some clarity about policy. They have some people working. They're maybe engaging with some parties, like, but fundamentally, nothing in the end is more important than are they actually going to be able to address the harms they're talking about and meet their darn goals? And well, staffing is part of that. And there's certainly sort of understanding clarity on the goals and the policy and things are prerequisites probably to success. I think we should be challenging and encouraging platforms to be very public about what they're doing to achieve harm reduction goals. And I want to highlight basically, I won't go through a list of them, of ways they can do this. But I want to highlight that there's at least two major sort of branches to this that we should be actively asking platforms about. And I think we do more on the one than we do on the other. The one we talk a lot about is enforcement. We say, okay, do you have the content moderation? Do you have the policy plus the content moderation so you can go in and either yourselves be removing content or limiting actors, or so that we could have a third-party fact-checking system will be applying labels to content. So this is where you find specific pieces of content or users or actions, and you enforce on them. And that is an important path. That is the policing of the online space. But the equally important branch, I think we spent a lot less time talking about, is what's the shape of their product and what are the choices that platforms can be making that reduce these harms without sanction. So this isn't being a cop. This is putting lights up in your park after dark, right? This is what can we do to make the space as a whole safer? And there's a bunch of examples of this. Things that reduce some dangerous virality, things that change user behavior, things that promote authoritative information. That's great. We all like that, but it isn't actually an enforcement. So I think we should be challenging platforms on both of those. Now, I'm going to come back to two things that we talked about at the top, and then I'm going to be handing back to Jeff. But the two things that we said at the top that were extra sort of concerns in general and this year are underserved communities or smaller communities, if I can call them that, and AI. So first of all, underserved communities. And while we would all like to say everybody gets the same protections no matter what, that would be the gold standard. We know that sometimes that is not going to happen. When that's not going to happen, the question is what it does happen. And this is something which I would love to see all of us being united as a set of voices about, what's better and worse in these less than perfect situations that we do find ourselves in. Because one of the options that, frankly, a lot of platforms end up choosing is they take a hands-off approach. They say, well, I can't operate my protections in this geography. And then they just stop. They stop talking and keep serving that community of users with no protections. I would strongly discourage platforms from doing this. So what can they do instead? Obviously, call in the experts, call in the NGOs. Now, that'll help you. Maybe you can arrange something where you could supplement your staff very easily. That doesn't tend to help you develop automation. So the staff may be really limited in what they can do, even if you do find a path to a bunch of experts who understand, I don't know, sort of the concerns and what's happening in Latvia during the EU elections, right? Because you didn't have anybody from Latvia on your staff. Now you've got connections to people from Latvia, but do you have classifiers that identify problematic content in Latvian and in Russian and other languages and communities of that particular place? Probably not. Some platforms try and rely on translating content. That's kind of even worse. It'll find some stuff, but tends to be very error prone. You can also use user signals, like what gets reported by the users who are local in that community. And this is where user reports can be lifesavers. You do have to be careful that you're not getting gamed. Oh, I'll just set up a team and we'll file 20 reports on everything that the opposing politician puts out. Okay, so you're going to have to still, it can help you find opportunities, but you can't action directly on it usually. And then this is where we talked on the previous slide about enforcement versus product shape. This is where product shape becomes really, really important. If you know your cops are going to be less effective because they don't necessarily have the local context or whatever other reason, this is when we really need to put the screws to companies and ask, well, then how are you making it safer? What are you doing? Can you reduce the virality? Can you amplify reliable information? And last but not least, if they can't make it safe, why do they feel it's okay to continue to serve that community without making that community safe in any way? And then the other is Gen AI. And I'm not sure any of us really know the answers here. The only thing I wanted to sort of highlight quickly is to say, certainly we should challenge to make sure that platforms are not, as well as we ourselves are not, fighting the last battle. Where we think we know what, low quality content looks like. We think we could spot a disinfo operation, right? Because a disinfo operation is going to have the exact same message coming out of a lot of different bots. Not anymore. Or the disinformation is likely to come from people who are not native speakers, so it's going to kind of be rough looking. Not anymore. LLMs are great at patching over that sort of stuff and making non-human content look a lot more human, right? So like, what can we rely on? And the answer is not some of the signals that we were relying on before. Similarly, I think there's a lot of work on like watermarking and trying to make the AIs themselves safer. But the AIs can also be jailbroken, or you can use open availability ones. So I don't really have any particularly good answers to this yet, other than big fan of journalism. I wish we could get people to actually go talk to the real journalists more often, but that's its own set of challenges. But at least we should be asking platforms what they're doing, and we should be challenging them to pick answers that are not out of date. That's the stuff I wanted to talk about. Jeff, would you like to pick back up?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Glenn. And I see a couple of really great meaty questions in the chat, and so happy to answer those maybe in chat, or definitely after our presentation we can dig into that too. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. So the next thing's on sort of like what should we expect from platforms is risk assessments. And, thanks to regulation and legislation around the world, this is now something that, we actually can expect from platforms, and we can expect them to report on this publicly, or at least turn it into governments, and hopefully it becomes public in the future. Right, so increasingly we see platforms are required to provide transparency and risk assessments. The DSA is obviously one that you're all probably familiar with, and the Code of Practice on Disinformation especially. But risk assessments are also going to be coming with the Online Safety Act. And there's lots of proposed legislation around the world, right? So there's bills in the US that have risk assessment components, in Canada and Australia, and et cetera. Which is good. Platforms should be held accountable for risks around elections and civic discussions, and they should, be making this transparent. We have our own report on what we would like to see in risk assessments, particularly for algorithms at the Integrity Institute. But a few things to highlight, right? So there's the reports archive, which I'm sure everyone related to EDMO is very familiar with, right? This is where the Code of Practice on Disinformation transparency reports go. And we're also going to be seeing both transparency reports and risk assessments from the DSA. So what are some basic components that we think should be included in risk assessments? And this isn't necessarily meant to be comprehensive and all-encompassing, right? This is sort of just like, at a minimum, here are a few things that we think should be covered. Totally happy to have other things included in them as well. So first off, an overview of the risk. We really want to see evidence that the company understands what the risk is, what the risk poses to individuals and societies, understanding, both the people who might be perpetrating the risk and the victims of it, and evidence that the company has really, internalized external expertise, right? Either through partnering with organizations or studying external research, all of that. We'd also like to see the companies cover how the risk manifests on the platform and interacts with the platform components, right? So there's one thing of just like understanding the risk and what the risk is, and then they also need to demonstrate that they understand exactly their role, the role that their platform plays in that risk, right? How does the platform fit into it? How can the platform end up contributing to the risk? And so this should definitely cover like algorithmic systems and the extent to which they can amplify any sort of risks. Should cover content moderation and policies. And also company governance, right? Like, how does a company make decisions? How do they measure harm? How do they measure success? That can frequently also play into the risks. The risk assessment should also cover the scale, cause, and nature of the harms related to the risk today. right? How many people are exposed to harmful or risk-related content, right? Why are those exposures occurring? The harms that occur today are very related to the risks that could occur in the future. And these could also look different for different size platforms, right? So large companies, right, have more resources. They can be more comprehensive here. Smaller companies might need to be a little bit more nimble and figure out when to lean more on external research or when to lean on the larger companies and external partners. So some election-related risks, just to provide examples, right? And we'll walk through one of these and what it could look like, what a risk assessment could include and look like. So what are some examples of election-related risks? You have election misinformation, right? This is the type of risk here is distribution of harmful content, right? Or content that can be harmful. There's foreign information and manipulation and influence, right? Or FIMI. This type of risk is the harm from malicious actors using the platform, right? So, if you see a foreign, intelligence agency, spreading content on the platform, you don't necessarily care if the content is harmful or benign or policy violating or, well within policy guidelines. You kind of don't want that activity. You don't want those actors on the platform at all, right? Because even benign content, they could be, building audience or so that they can influence them later, or they might be trying to build a track record to look, more reasonable and, less like an influence operation. And then finally, you have risks like the harassment of people with public profiles, right? And here the risk is from harmful behaviors, right? So harassment, threats of violence, doxing, the abuse of platform systems, right? So mass reporting or brigading, or like sending many direct messages targeted to a particular person. And we'll use election misinformation as kind of an example to show what a risk assessment might include. So first up, like what could the overview of a risk of the risk of election misinformation include, right? So election misinformation is fairly obviously like content that contains misinformation about the mechanics of voting. So this could be like the dates of an election, the process of registering the vote, or the process of voting itself. Election misinformation can cause harms both to people and democracies, right? So when it comes to people, obviously a person's vote could be suppressed because they didn't follow the proper procedures. And it can also harm society, right? Like election misinformation could ultimately, if spread wide enough, right, like cause the validity of an election to be disputed, even if the election process was safe and secure. And election misinformation has, both perpetrators and victims, and also someone can be both, right? So perpetrators, you could have organized efforts from like foreign influence operations that are trying to spread it. Victims obviously would include anyone who is exposed to the misinformation. Anyone who fails to vote successfully because of being exposed to misinformation is obviously a victim. And there can be people that are both, right? So people could end up spreading content that contains misinformation without actually knowing it, right? They just saw it, they thought that it was, they fell for it, right? And they quickly hit the reshare button without thinking about it, right? And so platforms should demonstrate their understanding is comprehensive and ideally, include expert consultation and validation. So how might a platform look at how election misinformation manifests on the platform, and what detail should they include? So for election misinformation, right, a lot of platforms are just sort of means of distributing information, right? Users can upload content, users can come to it to view content, right? And so that is why, someone would want to look to a platform to spread misinformation. Now, the vast majority of platforms already have content policies in place against election misinformation. So we don't necessarily need to force a definition on platforms externally, because the large majority of them already have it in place, but they should be digging into a detail, like for election misinformation that you have already deemed as violating, right? Like how is that interacting with the platform? So if you were someone who wanted to spread misinformation, you would look to the platforms as a way to reach large audiences. So platforms should cover, right? What are all the methods that different actors have of reaching large audiences on the platform? Are there any requirements or any checks that an account might have to go through before it reaches a large audience? Sometimes the spread of election misinformation will be inadvertent, and this will generally be enabled by having easy means of sharing content without friction. So this would be like, reshare buttons, retweet buttons, forward buttons. Sometimes the spreaders of election misinformation will be targeting specific audiences, right? And so they could actually be using the advertising system to target, a local group or a specific demographic group. Obviously, algorithmic systems of a platform play a role in misinformation. So any feed that shows user content or content from other users that they follow, or could be or content recommended by the platform directly. Advertising systems obviously include algorithms and can show users paid content. And elections of additional platform components that can play a role in election misinformation include the new user creation system, right? So, you could create a new user account that could be fake and used to spread election misinformation. All of the various means that users have of creating content on the platform, and all the various means that users have of easily sharing content on the platform. And so now we'll dig into the scale, nature, and cause of risks on the platform, right? And so as I said before, right, the future risk from a platform is actually strongly related to the current level of harm on the platform, right? If election misinformation, is spreading rampant today, then obviously that poses a pretty big risk for the future. And so we kind of need to know, right, how much exposure to election misinformation is there today if we want to understand the risk. So we have a framework for transparency that we made public, and that would include things like how many users are exposed to content that is known to violate election misinformation policies. And this could be, per day, per week, or per month. How many total exposures are there to content that the platform identifies as violating their election misinformation policies? What is the distribution of exposure frequencies for users? So this gets at the question of are the exposures concentrated in one set of users, or is it spread among all users? What is the prevalence of violating election misinformation content? So this means out of all, what fraction of all impressions on the platform are on content that the platform deems to be violating election misinformation policies? And then you could also ask, based on this prevalence, what is the estimated total number of exposures, right? And what is the estimated total number of users exposed? And this could be different from the first 2 points, right? Because not all election misinformation will be caught by the platform's content moderation processes, right? There is some election misinformation that is going to go unidentified and unnoticed, and the prevalence process hopefully will catch examples of those, and so you can use that to estimate, okay, here's how many users we know are exposed to violating content because we identified that content as violating and we counted up how many people were exposed to it. And here's an estimate of the total number of users that we believe, could be exposed to misinformation based on the prevalence estimate. And then, of course, we want to know, what fraction of exposures are occurring on surfaces on the platform for recommended content, or are occurring on algorithmically ranked feeds of content. What fraction of exposures are due to the platform recommending it to users, or what fraction of the exposures came from accounts that the user followed because the platform recommended that account to the user. And to get an example of why all these things are really important and why we're not quite getting them today. So why is it important that platforms disclose the true scale of harms? Well, currently what we get from platforms is mostly reports of prevalence, right? Or violating view rate, which is, what percentage of impressions are on violating content. And this can make the harms appear small, right? So, you see only a 0.1% prevalence of violating content. But on these platforms, especially the very, very large ones, small prevalences can map to huge numbers of exposed users. So for example, from one report that was leaked internally at Facebook, a 0.1%, there was a problem of, troll farms reaching Americans. The troll farms had a prevalence on the platform of about 0.13%. But that 0.13% mapped to over 100 million users in the US exposed to content from them every month, right? There's 140 million exposed users per month. So, even when you see a prevalence like 0.13%, okay, so the platform Facebook was, 99.87% not content from troll farms. That makes it seem like very good. But that small prevalence can still map to a huge number of users. Why is it important that platforms disclose the true cause of harms and the role of recommendations? So internal reports at Facebook, again, found that 64% of cases where a user joined a group that shared extremist content, 60% of those joins were recommended by the platform, right? So the platform systems and platforms design can play a really significant role in exposing users to harms. And the scale and cause are actually sort of interrelated when it comes to thinking about the risk, right? Both the scale and cause contribute to the overall risk level. So let's take an example of like a very high scale of harm will be very risky regardless of why the users are exposed, right? So if there's a platform out there that is exposing, 90% of its users to violating content, that is, incredibly risky regardless of how those users end up being exposed. But you could also imagine a situation where, there's a lower scale of harm, so fewer users are exposed to the harmful content, but that could still be very risky if all of those exposures or most of those exposures are coming from recommendations that the platform's making or because of the platform's design. So you can have, high risk even if there aren't that many people exposed on the platform today, if all those exposures are coming from the platform's choices. Okay, and now we're going to get into opportunities for impact on platforms. And so hopefully this is definitely something that is landing and is very clear, right? That platforms need outside expertise, right? And so many of our recommendations come down to, platforms involving and engaging external experts. There are a couple of different general strategies for getting the platforms to have a better impact on societies, right? So one strategy could be to partner with them, right? When and where the platforms are looking for outside expertise, right? There's lots of areas where platforms welcome and seek engagement with civil society, local experts and researchers. And of course, when this happens, it's really important to ensure that the platforms are engaging in a mutually beneficial way, right? So we don't want platforms to just be extracting, work out of civil society without contributing back to it. The other strategy, right, is to help pressure the platforms to do better through accountability efforts. And monitoring and accountability are good and really essential, right, for the platforms to behave responsibly. And even if a platform is behaving responsibly, right, we need monitoring and tracking to be able to validate, yes, this platform is behaving responsibly. So this is always an essential component. On the engaging with civil society, right, there are lots of different resources and potential partnerships where platforms are generally proactively seeking help, right? So platforms generally want to connect with election officials so that they can get hooked up to authoritative sources of information. Platforms proactively look for fact-checking organizations to partner with, getting accurate and authoritative information about the election dates and registration and deadlines. Ramping up on relevant issues. So, what are local human rights concerns? Is there any history of election issues? Are there experts on the media and news landscape and ecosystem for the region? Companies will also be looking for counterparts in other companies, right? So they can combine and share a little bit of detail there. And research collaborations, of course, too. Civil society is a really valuable resource for companies to understand the local context and how their platforms are being used. Now, how do we ensure that this engagement is successful, right? Ideally, we would see platforms proactively seeking engagement well before the election. So ideally, it would be 1 year before. Obviously, this is really important because, resources in civil society are definitely constrained. And we need civil society to be engaging early so that they can communicate those civil society's needs to the platforms. So that platforms can help ensure that the relationship sustains the civil society organizations. So it's very fair to communicate from civil society to the platforms. Here is what we need in order to make this mutually beneficial. And so hopefully the platforms are investing in the long-term sustainability of any sort of group that they're partnering with. It also should involve establishing escalation processes in the platform early, right? During emergency processes, you definitely don't want to be in a situation where you don't know who to contact inside of the platform, right? And so if the platform doesn't do the job of establishing escalation paths early, make sure that, the civil society organization is saying, hey, company, in times of emergency, we need to know who to contact, and here's our person who you can contact, because during the emergency, everyone's going to be focused on the emergency itself and won't have time to set up an escalation path. Now, a lot of engagements will also be based on when the platform is getting it wrong, right? And companies and platforms will get it wrong. They've definitely done so in the past. They will do so in the future, right? And companies can fail to address harms and increase risks in several different ways. So content that is likely violating the platform's existing policies could be spreading widely and rapidly. There could be content that is causing real harms that is being unaddressed by the platform's current policies. You could have harmful or risky content that is being amplified to the platform due to the platform's design. And often you can have all of these things sort of intermixing at once. So how can we effectively hold platforms accountable? Where accountability means, the platforms acknowledge the issue and change, or external incentives pressure the platforms to acknowledge the issue and change. And, from Glenn and I's experience on the inside, we have been on the inside and been like, thank you for this, external accountability. Thank you for bringing this to the company. Thank you for holding the company responsible so that, the people who are on the inside of the companies and trying to make it build more responsibly can have external validation of their efforts. So from our experience, we have like a little bit of tips on how this can be done. So making the calls for change actionable, right? So ideally, the calls for change will include both the current state and the desired state. This isn't always possible, right? So like sometimes, external organizations might not have the capacity, to really get into like, what is the solution? Or sometimes the solution will require insider knowledge, like data that only the platform has. Some effective strategies here could be to compare to other platforms, right? So, this other platform is doing it. Why can't you just do it too? Or comparisons to past actions from the platform. So it's like, hey, you did this for a previous election. Why not ours? Making calls sustained and enduring is really useful and effective, right? So unfortunately, some of the platforms seem to have learned that, they can ignore isolated negative press cycles by just like keeping their head low and waiting till it moves on. So pressure will be most effective when it can be sustained over long periods of time. And this can take the form of like long-term monitoring and tracking of the platform, or even creating measurements that can be tracked and reported. Or if it's an ad hoc individual issue, figure out how to tie it to a larger, more systemic issue, right? And so, an example of long-term monitoring that had a big impact was actually when, the New York Times started reporting out, here are the top 10 most performing posts on Facebook today, and started like doing that every single day to sort of highlight some of the systemic issues of content that was going viral on Facebook. That had a lot of impact internally. Scorecards can be really good, right, for tying smaller issues to larger systemic ones, as well as long-term tracking and accountability. Acknowledge and address, right, the difficult trade-offs that platforms can make, right? Like there are a lot of like genuine trade-offs that are hard to get right, that the platforms have to make, right? So, how do you allocate resources that are very limited across multiple important elections? When does expressing outrage become harassment or hate speech, right? This kind of gets into prioritizing safety versus not wanting to engage in over enforcement, right? Like these things are trade-offs. And so just like acknowledge that and help give guidance, right? Of like when the platform is getting that trade-off wrong, right? Like why are they getting it wrong? Help them, understand that. It'll also be more effective when you include multiple organizations, right? So building coalitions between civil society organizations, advertisers also, and government agencies, of course, right? So there's an example of the Stopping Hate for Profit movement, which started with advocacy orgs, but then moved to advertisers and was, putting a lot of pressure on Meta. There's also now a lot of like reports from government or very authoritative civil society organizations. So, the DSA has election integrity guidelines. The UN has, guidelines for maintaining information integrity, right? It can be very useful to point to, hey, the DSA is going to be asking you to do this. Can you please do this? Or can you please make it more comprehensive? And of course, elections are an opportunity to improve design. The most impactful changes a platform can make will usually involve changes to the platform's design. And this might feel a little bit counterintuitive, but even when an issue feels primarily like a content policy problem, those often are related to design, right? So if a platform wasn't systematically amplifying content that is hateful, then the exact nature of the hate speech policy wouldn't feel quite as existential, right? So even if the problem is like the platform's getting an exact hate speech definition wrong, that can often be related to like, well, the platform's amplifying hate speech overall or hateful content overall, so now we really have to worry more about where they're drawing the lines. But if the platform wasn't amplifying hateful content overall, then we wouldn't have to worry about exactly where that boundary was. And there is a growing corpus of best design practices from many different sources, including us and others. So sometimes, example design changes that you can point to will come from break the glass emergency actions that platforms have taken. And so Twitter, for example, in the past has added friction to the retweet button. WhatsApp in the past has limited the ability to forward messages. And Facebook has actually rolled out completely different newsfeed ranking algorithms around elections, right? And so, if these are making the platform safer during emergencies, why aren't they always using them, or why aren't they using them for all elections around the world? Other design changes that are good: improvements in content ranking and recommendation, moving away from engagement-based ranking, moving towards, only recommending content that users actually say that they are interested in proactively, rather than just like watching what they engage with, adding friction to virality in general, adding friction to known bad actor tactics. So this could be like adding rate limits to new or untrusted accounts, or limiting the ability of freshly created accounts to reach large audiences. Engaging maximum privacy settings by default, right? So making it harder for strangers to, DM many users, and limiting the visibility of accounts. And of course, advocating for increased transparency about the company goals and how they measure success and why exposures to harmful content are happening will provide a broad incentive for platforms to use more responsible design in general. So in summary, the environment in 2024 is just very different than it was a few years ago. But there is a lot that we need to be asking from platforms. But also, understand that there are different sizes of platforms, different scales of platforms. And so, they're going to need different levels of support from the outside to get it right. And there's lots of best practices that we need to be asking platforms follow. And hopefully, we can all help our efforts to hold the platform's accountability and ensure that they are building responsibly and engaging responsibly. Hopefully, we can all do that together from the outside.